Внимание, внимание! Внимание, внимание! Внимание, внимание!
Dear comrades, the City Council of People's Deputies announces that, in connection with the accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station, unfavorable radiation conditions are developing in the city of Pripyat. Necessary measures are being taken by the party, Soviet leaders, and local police. However, in order to ensure complete safety for residents, it has become necessary to carry out a temporary evacuation of the city's residents to nearby settlements of Kyiv Oblast. In order to do this, buses will be provided to every residence today, April 27th, beginning at 1400 hours, under escort of police officers and representatives of the party's City Executive Committee. It is recommended that you take documents like IDs, basic necessities, and foodstuffs for the immediate future. A list of workers that will stay behind to ensure normal functioning of the city has been assembled by local leaders. All evacuated apartments will be guarded by police. Comrades, upon leaving your homes, please do not forget to close windows, switch off electrical and gas appliances, and turn off water taps. Please remain calm, organized, and orderly during this temporary evacuation.
Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Content warning for this episode, mentions of Chernobyl-related pain and suffering, including children, and mentions of suicide.
So, it has been a minute since we released the last episode.
It has.
Would you like to remind everyone where we went last episode and where we left off?
We went to Pripyat, the city that was made for this nuclear plant, right?
Yes.
Right. And it was all fine and good until we decided to not look into safety hazards very carefully. And a reactor, well, which part of the reactor that was cooled by steam, like that produces the electricity,
Yeah, so all
overheated,
of the
right?
units, all of the units at Chernobyl were RBMK type reactors, and they had that steam, and so they didn't use water to cool and modulate, and so there were gaps in the steam, and the gaps in the steam led it to overheat. Yeah.
Right. Which led to the nuclear meltdown that we are all familiar with. And the KGB tried to kind of hide the seriousness of the situation at hand. But I think, did we leave off where like it's starting to become apparent, right?
Yeah. The world hasn't found out yet where we left off, but
Okay.
that is a good segue for where we're going. They are about to find out.
Okay.
So, the citizens of Pripyat were evacuated from their city a day and a half after the disaster began at the Chernobyl power plant, which was only 2.5 miles from their homes. And they knew little to nothing about the accident. What they'd been told was mostly lies, but they could see the red glow on the horizon over the power plant. If their family members were coming home, they were coming home with zipped lips, and you could see the secret in their faces. Like, I can't tell you what happened, but it was bad.
But something happened, and it was awful. Yeah.
Right. So they knew something had happened at Chernobyl, and that was more than the rest of the world knew. But that wasn't going to be for very long. So even before the evacuation was ordered, citizens of Pripyat left based on what they knew. They were like, my husband's coming home and he does not look good. He's suggesting we need to leave, so we're going to get the hell out of here. The first were the wives and children of the firefighters, who were the liquidators who received the brunt of the radiation exposure from the destroyed reactor. And they were called liquidators, everybody who helped with putting out the fire and then with cleaning up afterwards, everybody who helped in the aftermath of the accident. They were called liquidators because they sacrificed themselves to liquidate the consequences of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
Oh.
They suffered from constant vomiting, loss of consciousness, swollen bodies, just their whole body swelling up. And they were first treated with potassium iodide in milk. And this was because milk was traditionally used to treat burns in folk medicine. And so the doctors were just trying to do anything that they thought would help. But what they were dealing with were astronomical exposures to radiation, which they were completely unprepared to treat. Which doesn't make any sense because they were in Pripyat, but like we said in the first episode, no one expected that it could explode. Like, they probably had these ideas for what could go wrong at a nuclear power plant, but nobody thought it would fucking explode.
They didn't realize the gravity of the situation that could happen. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I talked about the symptoms experienced by the plant employees and by the liquidators, but since we'll be discussing acute versus chronic exposures in this episode, it makes sense to tease apart how different levels of exposure impact health outcomes. So, signs of acute radiation poisoning begin at around 0.05 sieverts of exposure when you're exposed to it all at once. And they present with the symptoms that I've already mentioned in the previous episode, including loss of appetite, nausea, and vomiting. And these can present within days or hours. At this level, the radiation kills the stem cells in the bone marrow, which is not good.
Not good. Yeah, I know that's like, I don't know a lot about anatomy and physics, but I know that that's bad.
Yeah, yeah. The bone marrow is like the birthplace of your blood cells. Like, it's not good.
Yeah.
When exposed to more than 1,000 sieverts, the symptoms present almost immediately, kind of like in K-19, the movie we watched. And not only is the bone marrow affected, but also the cells in the GI tract. And above 1,000 sieverts, which is just insane to think about, the cardiovascular and nervous systems are also impacted because of endothelial injury, oxidative stress, and inflammation. And all of this is actually known even among cancer patients receiving radiation therapies. In all cases of acute radiation sickness, patients go through 4 stages. The first is the onset of symptoms, and the second is a latent period in which they feel better for a few hours or even a few weeks. And then the manifest illness stage returns with worsened symptoms. Finally, the patient either recovers or dies, and that's the 4th stage, is recovery or death.
Okay.
Yeah. And recovery can take up to 2 years. But exposure to 200 sieverts of radiation or more is an absolute death sentence, likely from a collapse of the circulatory system and increased pressure in the head caused by edema, vasculitis, and meningitis. Yeah, it's one of the worst ways I could possibly think of going out. The Chernobyl patients were divided into 4 groups based on estimated exposure once they figured out what was going on. The uppermost group, receiving an estimated 130 to 320 sieverts of exposure, all died. A third of the next lowest group died, and only one person exposed to 82 sieverts or less died. And so even if you don't reach that death sentence level, like, it's an insane amount of radiation, even if you're not at 200 or 1,000. The explosion of Unit 4 on April 26, 1986, sent a black cloud of death into the sky. Particles from the destroyed reactor, as well as gaseous xenon-133, iodine-131, and cesium-137, along with 20 million curies of radioactivity, were carried away on the wind. And this means that every second, the radioactive elements of the cloud decayed into 740 quadrillion alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays. So this is what we talk about when we talk about radioactivity and radioactive decay. And it's not something you can put into sieverts because the decay process isn't impacting your organs, which is what sieverts are. This is just a measure of that activity at its barest level. So That is to say, there was a lot of fucking radioactivity that was being carried away on this cloud. It was carried away over Pripyat past Poland, and on Sunday the 27th, radiation was logged at the Riso National Laboratory in Denmark. Although, being a Sunday, no one was on duty to read it. That evening, a soldier at the Finnish National Defense Forces station in southern Finland reported an increase in background radiation, but no one in Helsinki reacted to it. It wasn't until the poisonous cloud became pregnant with moisture and rained down its radioactive load 2 hours south of Stockholm in Gävle, Sweden, that the world became aware of the catastrophe.
Oh.
Right. So this is how we find out.
Radiated rain,
Yeah.
sounds awful. Like,
There's a lot of it in this episode.
okay.
But the workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Gävle originally believed that they'd done something to cause the radiation they were picking up.
Oh.
Construction workers had been hired around this time to build a repository for nuclear waste at the station, and they'd gotten used to checkpoints that they needed to pass through for their workday, which included some radiation monitoring points that were also used by technicians going to and from their internal posts. And so it wasn't so much that they thought the construction workers would be exposed to radiation. I mean, I think they still had to carry cards or whatever, but it was mostly technicians used these same ones. But on April 28th, the first construction workers to report in to work at around 7 a.m. found that there seemed to be something wrong going on with the radiation monitors, because these monitors were going off when these workers were just coming in from their commute. Like, there was no reason for them to be going off. And so they were like, okay,
Right.
there's something wrong with the monitor. We'll figure it out. I'm sure you're fine. But then all of the workers clocking in that morning started setting off the monitor. And they were like, okay. We need to look at this, actually. That doesn't seem right.
Yeah, and we should probably look at that sooner than later, maybe.
Yeah. So clearly, the contamination was coming from outside the plant. And so they took somebody's shoe and they analyzed their shoe for isotopes. And this revealed the same isotopes that lived inside the Forsmark 1 reactor. And so they're thinking this is a worst case scenario for them. Their reactor is leaking and it wasn't caught, and now it's like out in the air. Like, the reaction that the Swedes have to this possible contamination versus what the Soviets had to the worst nuclear disaster
possible.
in history.
Yeah, the worst possible scenario. Like,
yeah. It's pretty bad comparatively for the Soviets. So the Swedes had their local authorities order citizens to keep their distance from Forsmark. They set up roadblocks, which, this was terrifying for the workers inside. The whole plant was evacuated because they're thinking if it's bad outside, it must be bad inside. It's better to try to get fresh air.
Okay.
Figure it out. So it's around this time when they evacuate that the Swedish nuclear and defense agencies learned that there were similarly high levels of contamination at a facility in Studsvik, which was 200 kilometers from Forsmark. Air samples were also taken in Stockholm, which were found to contain graphite particles as well as radioisotopes. And this indicated that Forsmark was likely not the source of the contamination.
Which had to be there had to be a sense of relief, but also what the hell is happening?
Yeah, yeah. It's not us, and somehow that's worse.
Yeah.
Using meteorological calculations specifically developed to monitor the partial test ban treaty on nuclear weapons trials, the Swedish National Defense Research Institute was able to trace the cloud back across the Baltic by about 1 p.m., and at 2 p.m. they started asking very pointed questions of the USSR. And the Soviets assured the Swedes that they had no idea who was behind the contamination of their country. They have this opportunity to come clean, and they're like, no, this was not us. Yeah.
No, not it. Not it. Okay.
Meanwhile, back in Chernobyl, some 5,000 people who stayed behind worked to put the behemoth to sleep for good. They'd accepted that water couldn't drown the beast, since the reactor was so hot that it split the water into its explosive hydrogen and oxygen components. Someone suggested making a radiation-resistant heavy concrete with iron shot stockpiled at the plant's construction site. But this was stored in a warehouse in the direct path of the fallout, and so they were like, we can't. We're going going to get
We
super
can't even get
exposed.
in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they were like, well, we can't just let it burn itself out. Like, how long is that going to take? If it hadn't already, the zirconium cladding around the remaining uranium dioxide fuel pellets could melt and release even more radiation into the air. Like, it's just going to get worse if we don't do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
A deputy from the Kurchatov Institute estimated that the graphite left in the core was burning at around 1 metric ton per hour, and if left unchecked, could continue burning for well over 2 months, which could continue to release radiation into the air that would eventually reach every corner of the globe.
So did they do something? Like, they did something, right? Like,
They
they
did
did something
something. They did
at this
something.
point. Okay, good.
Yes. The solution they settled on was an attack from above. So,
Okay.
using helicopters, they dropped a combination of clay, lead, and dolomite in hopes that the combination would cool the graphite and nuclear fuel and block the release of radioactive particles. And dolomite is a mineral that contains calcium and magnesium carbonate. And so they hoped that that would decompose into carbon dioxide and that would help smother the fire because it will deplete the oxygen.
Okay.
And then they were also going to use lead because it has a low melting point. And they were hoping that that would melt and then sink deep into the core and solidify as a permanent barrier against the gamma radiation. But the biggest problem with this plan was that none of the materials were currently anywhere near the plant. Like, they were like, cool idea, how are we going to execute it?
Very cool. Yeah, we can't do that right now.
Right. So until they could source what they needed, they had to use powdered boron from a nearby plant in Rovno, and then they gathered sand from the bank of the Pripyat River. But this meant that the people collecting it, which was mostly like nearby farm workers who didn't realize that their soil they were tilling was contaminated. All of these people were exposed to radiation while they shoveled the sand into the trucks for transport to the plant. 165 tons of sand and boron were dropped on April 27th, and the helicopter pilots who made the drops did so without any protection against the gamma and neutron radiation that was spewing from the core. And unfortunately, the opening of the core, huge as it was, destructive as it was too narrow for the airdrops to capture more than maybe 20% of each load. The liquid... right. The liquidators...
Yeah, like, once again, cool plan, but...
yeah.
In execution, not so much.
Yeah. The liquidators had dosimeters monitoring their exposure, but they did little other than to tell them, you're not going to be feeling good after this, because there's, like, nothing that they could do to make this plan go any faster. Each drop required the pilots to hover over the opening of the core for about 4 minutes, and that exposed them to 0.17 to 0.7 sieverts of radiation with every drop. And they had to do multiple drops, and every time something actually managed to get into the core, a small mushroom cloud that was filled with graphite dust and radiation rose up out of the reactor and consumed the helicopter.
Right.
After the first round of sand and dolomite, the bottoms of the helicopters were then reinforced with lead. But that still didn't do a whole lot to protect them. And so these helicopter pilots were essentially sacrificed for the cause of burying the reactor. The next day, twice as much material was dumped into the thriving core. Despite their lies earlier in the day, the first official statement on the accident was broadcast at 8 p.m. in Moscow by the state news agency TASS.
An accident has taken place at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Aid is being given to those affected. A government commission has been set up.
An hour later, it was broadcast in English for the Radio Moscow World Service. And interestingly, neither translation included a mention of when the accident took place, some 44 hours before. Soviet news stations remained quiet about the incident the following day, either not mentioning it at all or burying it beneath public interest stories. The liquidators remained busy and dropped another 827 tons of material onto the core that refused to cool. Meanwhile, the headline of the New York Post read,
2,000 die in nuke mare. Soviets appeal for help as in-plant burns out of control.
Soviet officials insisted that the death toll was only 2 by the time the Kremlin released their statement, which at that time we now know was actually true. There were only 2 people who had died. The guy who was instantly killed in the blast and the other guy who was injured severely by the blast and then died a few hours later.
Right, but it's not going to stay that way.
It is not, because there are 197 people who were hospitalized as a result of the accident, including Alexander Akimov and Leonid Tuptanov, who irradiated themselves to get the coolant water to Unit 4 in the hours after the disaster, as well as their deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, who was there when the accident occurred. All of these men were among the 26 who were airlifted to Moscow the morning of April 27th, when Pripyat hospitals realized the extent of the radiation poisoning they were ill-equipped to treat. But the rest of the world was not at all inclined to believe that that was how things were. They'd already waited 2 days to fess up to the accident, so what else might they be lying about? And it didn't help that Soviet President Gorbachev refused to speak personally on the matter with other world leaders in order to clear up confusion. The number 2000, then, came from a Western reporter who met with a woman in Kyiv, and who this woman is or what her credentials were are not known, just some random Ukrainian woman. But the number made its way through the grapevine, and a source at the United States Pentagon with access to satellite images of the plant agreed that 2,000 deaths, quote, seemed about right, since 4,000 worked at the plant. And so, just based on the destruction alone, there's no way that more than half of these people survived.
Right.
And then other rumors started spreading as well. There was the Bridge of Death myth, which was a myth that I've actually talked to people when I was like, what do you remember about Chernobyl? They were like, oh, I remember the Bridge of Death. And this was a railway bridge where you could kind of see the Chernobyl power plant from Pripyat, and people apparently were supposed to have been standing on this bridge. And in my mind, I imagined that there was just like a whoomp, like in a horror movie, and you see their skeletons and then they die. I think that's what the Bridge of Death myth is. That didn't happen. But rumors were especially rampant in the countries of the USSR that were experiencing a media blackout to avoid spreading information and disinformation. These rumors included the supposed death toll of thousands because human life has no value in the Soviet Union, and you can see why some people in the Soviet Union were starting to really think that that's how it was.
Yeah.
They also heard that martial law was enacted in the region and that people were being shot on the spot for looting during the fallout. None of these things actually happened. But it didn't help that orders were being sent to libraries to remove books containing the word radiation because the Soviet government thought that less knowledge meant less panic. And they didn't realize that in a vacuum, people were just going to fill it with whatever they were coming up with on their own.
Right. Like, if you take away the source of information, it doesn't mean that they're just going to stop talking about it.
No, it's the biggest piece of news going on right now. We're going to talk about it.
Right.
It's hard to say how much value really was given to human life over the reputation of the Union when they'd allowed a cloud of radiation to travel without warning over much of Eastern Europe. Danish pharmacies sold out of potassium iodide tablets, and in Sweden, calls poured into the government lines to ask if it was safe to drink the water or go outside. The New York Post sensationalized the situation further by reporting that there were unconfirmed reports after the explosion. 15,000 people had been killed in the accident and their bodies were burned and buried in a mass grave at a nuclear waste disposal site. So, good job, New York Post. Good job.
Yeah.
The last of the airdrops were made at the beginning of May. After 8 days of flying from dusk until dawn to drop over 18,000 tons of sand, boron, dolomite, and lead, which ended up releasing around 24 million radionuclides, none of the original pilots were still on site, and most were being treated for radiation sickness in Kyiv. It's amazing that the unit didn't fully collapse under the weight of all the sand and clay, and this fear was what actually led them to cancel the airdrops. That, and the fact that they realized the drops weren't doing anything to help, and they'd be better off just letting the reactor burn itself out for 2 months. But unfortunately, beneath all of it, tons of fuel and zirconium cladding had heated to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit underneath the destroyed unit and were gearing up for yet another explosion. At the same time, the May Day preparations were in full swing in Kyiv and Moscow. So, May 1st was one of the most significant and important Soviet political holidays. The other one being November 7th, which was the day of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And to this day, May Day is actually recognized in many countries other than the United States as the Day of International Worker Solidarity in remembrance of the massacre in Haymaker Square, which was ironically in Chicago in 1886. But instead of remembering that and everybody who died there, we have Labor Day in September. So in the Soviet Union, May Day was celebrated with mass demonstrations and parades, but it was also celebrated by the less political citizens of the Union because it gave them a springtime holiday to gather in public, which wasn't typically allowed by the regime. So basically, everyone in the most populated cities of the USSR were going to be outside when the radioactive cloud was going to be directly overhead. Already on the 29th of April, radiation levels in Kyiv were 5 times the norm. But even with these rising levels and urging from medical professionals within the KGB, party leaders still debated whether or not the parade should be held. Because, we got to keep a facade going.
Right.
And they ultimately decided, yeah, let's go through with plans as usual.
No.
Yes. Because the parades, we got to make sure everybody thinks we're doing okay because they heard about our little oopsie daisy and we got to let them know it's fine.
If we cancel it, they're going to know something's really bad.
Right.
It's going to be
right.
Going the Okay.
Which, do you guys honestly not think that we know it's bad? You had a fucking meltdown. We know it's bad.
Right.
But they decided, it's important enough to potentially sacrifice some people, but not as many as usual. Okay, we'll change it up so not as many people as usual will attend. That'll be our compromise. But we won't tell people why they can't attend. We'll just make it so fewer people could be there.
Okay.
Because typically, each of the 10 districts in Kyiv sent between 4,000 and 4,500 representatives to the May Day rallies. And instead, in 1986, they were asked to only send 2,000 and ensure that they were all young people. We want it to be very skewed to the youth demographic, which was a terrible, terrible choice.
Yeah.
And then the length of the parade was reduced from 4 hours down to 2. Still, this meant that some 2.5 million people were exposed to radiation so that the Soviet Union could save face in front of the world. One attendee, a woman by the name of Natalia Petrovina, recalled this after the rally.
I sat down on a bench to rest. I felt weak and dizzy. My throat was dry with a strong tickle.
Which were obvious signs of radiation poisoning. Other attendees felt burning sensations in their mouths or tasted metal. Another woman, Natalia Morozova, came from Odessa to attend the rally in Kyiv. She was pregnant at the time, so I'm unsure how far along she was. And she left Kyiv on May 12th, and in July, her child was stillborn. The children who participated wore special costumes, which were then put on display at local schools until the KGB discovered they were giving off high levels of radioactivity. Following the holiday, 1,800 people, including 445 children, were hospitalized with symptoms of radiation exposure.
Was it worth it?
Nope. Nope. The ambient radiation was not the only danger presented to the citizens of the Soviet Union, however. The winds that carried the radionuclide-filled cloud to Scandinavia shifted, and so a similar, smaller cloud was pushed to the northeast in the direction of Moscow, which had a population of roughly 10 million people at the time, including, of course, top Soviet leadership. This cloud prepared to rain down radioactive contamination just as it had over Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. And this presented a real issue to Soviet experts. Maybe because top leadership lived there. Maybe because 10 million people lived there. Who's to say who was more important?
I think we know.
Right. But so they had to do something. And their solution for this particular problem was cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is real, it's safe, and it's primarily been used to increase snowpack or just conditions with drought, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is not regularly used to control precipitation. It has been used for, negative things. It was used in Vietnam, mostly just to make the roads muddy, but it was still used in wartime. But that's the most nefarious thing I could find related to cloud seeding.
Okay.
Other than, maybe some chemical effects from silver iodide, but right now it's fine. And it is controlling the weather. I will concede that. But the big but is that it's not creating hurricanes or tornadoes. It is not
Right.
controlling the weather to that degree.
Right.
People think the government can do that, and it can't. Hurricanes and tornadoes have always existed, and if we could control them, we would be controlling them more, but we're not. And
Right.
So cloud seeding. They did cloud seeding. And it's the process of creating clouds or making clouds bigger so that they rain using supercooled liquid. Usually ice, but you can also use substances with a crystalline structure similar to ice. And this is where the silver iodide comes in.
Mm.
These substances then are released out the back of a plane as a vapor into the atmosphere. We're not talking about chemtrails right now.
Right.
And while they're in the atmosphere, they attract moisture in the air because they are either ice or similar to ice. They create clusters of ice, and then that is released as snow or rain, depending on the temperature of the ground.
Right.
And there's some debate over how effective this even is for augmenting precipitation during drought situations, but it did work to force the radioactive clouds heading towards Moscow to release their poisoned burden before reaching the capital of the Soviet Union. In this case...
But they still had to be released somewhere.
What an astute observation you're making. And yes, it was a problem for somebody, just not top leadership in Moscow. It was released over sparsely populated farmland in Belarus instead. The fallout area here that was impacted by this black rain, it was eventually evacuated, but not immediately, because this whole operation was secret and to this day remains way too contaminated for people to even live there. But, in Moscow, they got to have their parade, so good for them. Back at Chernobyl, with tons of sand, lead, and boron pressing down on the superheated uranium fuel that continued to rise in temperature at the bottom of the reactor, scientists worried about that impending explosion that I mentioned before. Specifically, they were worried about a reactor doomsday situation, referred to in shorthand as the China syndrome. And this was the name. It's not as racist as it sounds, I promise. I wouldn't have mentioned it.
I was like, why?
Yeah. No, I was worried about it too when I first saw it. I was like, where are we going, guys? No, it was the name of a 1979 movie, which was actually released less than a month before the meltdown at 3 Mile Island. In the movie, Jane Fonda plays a TV reporter who learns about safety cover-ups at a nuclear power plant, as well as the possibility of a mass of melted uranium fuel burning through the base of a faulty reactor, through the Earth, and all the way to China. Hence the China syndrome. Yeah, it's not racist. Okay. It's just dumb. It's super dumb because...
Well, it's not... Yeah, it's dumb, like scary, but dumb.
Yeah, well, it's just like... It wouldn't...
Like, would that happen? Like, that's not how it works.
No, it wouldn't go through the core of the Earth, and it wouldn't end up in China. It would end up in, like, the fucking ocean, right? So I think that the scientists mostly knew that it was Hollywood bullshit, but they were like, what if it does eat through the bottom of the reactor? Because if it happens here, we're above a water table. And so there was issues with burning uranium fuel melting through the bottom of a man-made reactor, very possible. And if it reached the water, it could poison the Pripyat River, which not only provided drinking water for 30 million people, but it also flows into the Black Sea. And so we're talking about global contamination.
Right.
But even more realistic of a concern was the possibility that the uranium would eat through the bottom of the reactor, hit the water, and then create steam on contact, and then explode because of this built-up steam. And scientists estimated that this explosion would be orders of magnitude larger than the first explosion at Chernobyl. It would destroy the other 3 reactors, and a blast of this size would be equal to 5 million tons of TNT and would kill it would kill everything that remained alive inside the 18-mile exclusion zone, and then would make a large part of Europe completely uninhabitable with the fallout that would follow. At the very least, the exclusion zone around the blast of this size would be over 300 miles, extending through most of Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova into Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and of course Russia. Like, the Eastern Bloc would just be gone.
Right.
Not only that, but it didn't even have to reach the water table to get to that point yet, because the basement of Unit 4 was flooded with water from everybody trying to put the reactor out with water the night of the explosion. And because it just poured through the corridors and then it collected in the basement. They sent in Chief Shift Engineer Boris Bananov, as well as Valery Blespalov, and they were to be led by Alexei Ananenko, a mechanical engineer who was familiar with the valve system, who would be able to go down with these men very quickly, times of the essence, and then drain the remaining water they couldn't pump out so that the basement would be clear. And they understood that sending 3 men down there was necessary because this will help us put the water where it's supposed to be instead of just some random place in Chernobyl, the city, or Pripyat, or wherever we're putting these tons and tons of water. We have to do this, but it's basically a suicide mission to send these guys underneath the reactor that just exploded. But miraculously, not only did they succeed in their mission, using nothing more than diving suits as protection, and saved the lives of millions of people in Europe, but they lived. They're still alive. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's hard to believe it, but it's hard to believe it especially because there were myths that these guys died immediately and then were buried in lead coffins. But no, they were still alive. Ananenko was in the HBO documentary that I watched called Chernobyl: Secrets, Lies, and the Untold Stories. So, yeah, very cool. They are alive. They lived. And maybe it's because they were underneath.
Right.
I mean, they didn't have health impacts that they discussed.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So, as far as the concerns about penetrating to the water table, workers began the massive undertaking of freezing the ground beneath the reactor and then building a concrete platform that molten fuel couldn't burn through. And then, in the event that it still did burn through, I mean, we'll have the explosion to think about, but they decided to install water filters in the Pripyat River to avoid radionuclide contamination. So,
Okay.
the reactor was semi-buried, unlikely to explode again, but it was still spewing out millions of curies of radiation, increasingly more every day, which was extremely worrying. Plans were made to evacuate Kyiv if necessary, but officials worried that an evacuation announcement in the 3rd largest city in the Soviet Union would cause panic, looting, and death. So I guess they are still worried about death, but it's like, are you really? Like, maybe?
Yeah, which kind of death? Like,
Right. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. So instead of evacuating, they continued to act as though nothing was amiss. And it was only on May 6th that the people of Kyiv were given instructions for how to protect themselves from ambient radiation exposure. They were told to remain indoors, close the windows, and protect against drafts. All of this, along with the leaked rumors of the possibility of a second larger explosion, because they're still trying to pump the water out at this point,
Right.
like that project's not done. This sparked chaos in the 3rd largest city in the Soviet Union.
I mean, rightfully so, though.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I mean, like,
Like, if
Yeah.
they're like, hey, there was a little tiniest accident, and you have
whoopsie.
you have new neighbors now, so that's fun. Are you all getting along? Cool. A lot of you got sick at the parade, and that's a real bummer, but everything's fine.
Our bad.
Just stay inside with the windows closed. Everything's fine as long as you do that. Like,
Like, okay, how am I supposed to get food? How am I supposed to get to work? Like,
are they
are we
thinking
just
about
not doing that anymore? Like,
right? Pretty sure that's not the plan. Pretty sure you still need to
right.
work.
Yeah, like,
Are
okay.
these leaders thinking about how they would receive these messages? Because it seems like not a whole
Right.
lot of introspection is being done here.
No.
So thousands of people attempted to escape the city via the clogged railway station. The number of flights out of Kyiv had to be doubled, banks ran out of money, pharmacies sold out of iodine pills, and liquor stores ran out of red wine and vodka, which
Like, yeah.
which the Ukrainian deputy minister of health was forced to make an announcement saying alcohol is useless against radiation, so you just are partying now. Like, that's all you're doing.
Yeah, I guess that, okay, like, I get what they were thinking, but, like, I was like, they just want to get fucked up.
Maybe
Like,
some of them
that's
did.
what's happening, right? Yeah, like, they're like, all right, well, we're going down. I'm gonna get a little stinky in the event of that.
The less fun thing that people did was they turned to tinctures of iodine for internal protection when it's only meant as an external antiseptic, and this led to esophageal burns. Yeah. On the 8th, the radioactivity pouring out of the reactor finally began to slow down, indicating that the fuel fire was finally dying down and that any degree of the China syndrome was now unlikely, though not impossible. And on the 11th, Moscow Central TV made the first broadcast from the exclusion zone, which depicted masked policemen controlling traffic at roadblocks in recently deserted towns, but also showed that the situation was safe because, look, these people are out here and
There's people. They're not skeletons. Look.
we're not going to kill the rest of the people in the country or the world. It's fine. Would you guys just calm down? Look at how it's fine.
Right.
And the deputy minister even said in this broadcast, "We are firmly convinced the danger has passed." The theoretical physicists in Moscow disagreed.
Yeah. I'm a layman and I disagree. Like,
Cleanup efforts began exactly at ground zero. They had to begin where they were the absolute worst, in the crumbling remains of Unit 4, even as it continued to leak radiation. Anatoly Mayoritz arrived at the plant 2 weeks after the explosion as a representative of the Ministry of Energy and was immediately saddled with not only coordinating all of the ministries, like all of the other ministries working on the cleanup, but also with counting people and lives.
whenever they discussed ways of performing a particular task, such as collecting the fuel and graphite ejected by the explosion, entering the highly radioactive zone, or opening or closing some gate or valve or other, the new chairman of the government commission would say, to do that, we are going to have to count 2 or 3 lives. And for that task, 1 life.
Ministry officials had to count the minutes personnel spent inside highly contaminated regions, ticking the hours off the ends of the lives of 600,000 men and women liquidators conducting the cleanup, as well as their own. But there was no other option. One of the early liquidators, a man identified by the Pravda newspaper as Dmitry Zuravlev, is quoted as saying,
We have a sacred principle, the sacred principle of brotherhood. Specialists who came up here from Belarus are working side by side with us. I have met people from Moscow, Leningrad, and other cities of our motherland and in the town center. They all want to help Ukraine overcome the disaster that occurred here as quickly as possible.
Unfortunately, that sacred principle was apparently only adhered to by the Brotherhood of the Liquidators, and not the ministry officials directing them to carry out duties. The majority of the liquidators were draftees of the military, boys aged from 18 to 20, who didn't understand the extent of the danger they were in. Draftees from the Central Asian republics were especially susceptible to exploitation as they did not even understand the Russian language. Radiation exposure for industry personnel is limited to 0.25 sieverts, which is still considered high, but these draftees were permitted to absorb as much as 0.45 sieverts while performing their tasks, almost twice as much. There was also an air of machismo that encouraged the men in particular to disregard safety procedures, like the wearing of respirators or properly monitoring time worked that add to the toll.
That's wild. Like,
Yeah.
I could not imagine like being like, I'm such a man's man that like radiation and nuclear fallout doesn't affect me because I am so manly. Like, wild.
Yeah, that's a new kind of fragile masculinity I don't think I've encountered. Like, ooh,
Yeah.
wearing a respirator is girly. Like,
Yeah, like safety.
yeah.
Like I get like I know like motorcycle helmets for example, like no, I don't need that, or skateboard helmet, like I like that I've seen, but
Yeah.
nuclear fallout and radiate, like that's a new level. That's
Boys
a new
will be
level.
boys.
Uh,
The first liquidator to die was the 47-year-old chief of the electrical unit, Alexander Lilichenko, on May 7th. Originally, he'd been hospitalized in Pripyat, but left the hospital to assist his colleagues with the liquidation and received a massive dose of radiation. 3 days later, two 23-year-old lieutenants of the firefighting units at Chernobyl, named Volodymyr Pravik and Viktor Kibanuk, died from exposure, and then the trickle of deaths became a torrent. Within just a few months, 28 of the liquidators died from acute radiation syndrome, although that was not the only cause of death. In the months and years to follow, many more would die from complications of their exposure. On average, the liquidators working in the exclusion zone received 120 times the yearly dosage of radiation, which is considered safe by the International Commission on Radiological Protection. But the liquidators were not the only people endangered by unleashing the horrors of Pandora's box in Chernobyl. 21 different radionuclide isotopes seriously contaminated the regions up to 190 miles away from the plant, which posed a threat to the population of Europe, not just from the irradiated dust blown their way, but also by poisoning the food chain as these isotopes settled into the soil, crops, and animals in the food chain. Sofia Moskalenko was 10 years old and living in Kyiv at this time, and wrote about her experience at Vox. And this is a little bit longer of an excerpt, but I thought it was important to get her point of view as a child living in Kyiv.
Our next door neighbor, Elena, a researcher at the Kiev Institute of Nuclear Physics, drew my mother into our room and closed the door behind them. Said we should keep our windows closed, and that I must stay home instead of going to school. A classmate whose father was a policeman swore a bunch of us to secrecy at recess, then told us about the protective gear the military was using when dispatched into Chernobyl, and of the special chemical showers they had to take on the way out. Our neighbor Irene procured a Geiger counter and hauled it home one night. We hovered its wand over milk, eggs, and bread. Everything crackled, contaminated with radiation. We wondered out loud if this device was defective. Irene had to return the counter the next day, but its crackle stayed in my mind, a soundtrack to my worries.
Almost 9,500 people were hospitalized in connection with the accident by May 10th. More than half of that were children, and of those children, 26 were diagnosed with radiation sickness. Although records may not reflect the true magnitude of the situation, because Moscow instructed doctors to only describe severe cases of ARS as such, while lower dose or less severe cases were not to mention radiation at all, and instead needed to state that patients were diagnosed with, quote, vegetated vascular dystonia triggered by the environment.
Okay.
With contamination a constant threat and concerns about the long-term effects of exposure, an evacuation for the children of Kyiv was ordered in mid-May for those in preschool through 7th grade and all who had already been evacuated from Pripyat and the surrounding area. These children, attended only by the thousands of nursing and pregnant mothers also swept up in the evacuation, amounted to a fifth of the city's population that relocated to safe areas east. Pioneer camps, sanatoriums, and resorts across the Union filled with young radiation refugees for 3 months. Again, Sofia Moskalenko wrote,
It was more of a boot camp than a vacation. We weren't allowed to venture past a certain perimeter. A rigid schedule kept us occupied from dawn to dusk. Every day we practiced marching formations and sang military songs. In my letters, I begged my mother to take me away.
By the end of May alone, an area larger than the U.S. state of Delaware had become dangerously contaminated despite the Sisyphean efforts of the liquidators to wash the structures worth saving and bury the buildings, farmland, and shrubbery that was too contaminated. But the effects of wind and precipitation often recontaminated regions that were previously decontaminated. Surviving animals, including pet dogs and cats left behind in the evacuations, were also now starving sources of poison, covered in irradiated fur and dust, and were specifically hunted to avoid contamination and attacks. Although, rather than killing all of these poor abandoned pets, some of the soldiers sent to hunt them adopted them instead and gave them the names of the dark future, like Dotsa, Gamma, and Dotsameter, which I think is very cute and very cyberpunk.
Yeah, like, that's precious, actually. Like, that's, like, and adopting that, like, all right.
Yeah.
All right.
These radionuclides poisoning every animal, vegetable, and mineral they settled upon could not be destroyed any faster than they decayed. They can't be burnt or broken apart. They can only be buried, entombed in dirt, or lead. And this was the fate for the irradiated bodies of the liquidators as well as Unit 4 itself. The Kremlin prioritized getting the other 3 units of Chernobyl back online. Not so much for the energy they generated as, again, for the symbolism. To do this, Unit 4 needed to be completely isolated from the other units, and it was attached to Unit 3 because they kind of come in pairs.
Right.
As early as May 12th, however, the Ministry of Energy realized that this was beyond their scope, and the Ministry of Medium Machine Building was called in to come and sacrifice their men for the 440,000-ton tomb that would officially and forever encapsulate and bury the disgrace of the Soviet Union. A $5.5 billion concrete walled structure, officially called the sarcophagus. Unit 4 was officially interred on November 30th, 1986. And although we're most of the way through our second episode on it, I would say that ultimately this is what closed the first chapter of the story. There's multiple ways to tell the Chernobyl story, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Much more cleaning and healing still remained, but it could now be done without re-injury from the open reactor. In August, global public opinion shifted sympathetically for the scientists and workers at the power plant as much as it was able to. The International Atomic Energy Agency held a conference in Vienna where they expected the Soviets to speak because of the timing of the conference, but they didn't expect them to say much because they really hadn't up to this point. So, like, they're just kind of like, whatever, we'll give you your 30 minutes and be fair. And the delegate, Valery Legasov, who was played by Jared Harris in the HBO drama series, he wanted something more to come from this meeting than just sort of going through the motions, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so he promised them that he had something to say of value to the agency in the world. And so they were like, okay, well, if you actually have something to say, Chernobyl's a pretty big deal, we'll give you 4 hours. And he ended up actually going over 4 hours because he had a huge speech that he gave. He unveiled the inner workings of the RBMK reactor at Chernobyl, which nobody else really knew about how it worked or what they were doing. He detailed a description of the accident and included all of the factors we talked about last episode that led to the meltdown. And this was important because at this point, the Kremlin was basically scapegoating the personnel there. They were like, it was entirely human error. So it was entirely just training and people, and it wasn't the reactors at all. And this guy Legasov was like, it was a lot of things.
Right. It was a multitude of things and like a kind of a perfect storm like situation. Yeah. Like
Right. So when he was done, the other scientists gave him a standing ovation for his presentation and left the conference understanding that Soviet scientists were also dealing with the outcome of these circumstances, and they were willing to share what they'd learned in order to prevent future disasters. Like, it wasn't going to be this insular thing anymore. It was, we understand, we as the scientists, not the leadership, we understand how bad this is, and we are still a part of your community, even if we exist in the USSR and we have to live behind the Iron Curtain. Although Legasov wasn't imprisoned or killed, for blowing the metaphorical lid off the buried shame of the USSR, he was snubbed by Soviet leadership. And I should actually mention that he was a pretty integral part of, like, measurements of the radioactivity and cleanup. And he was actually the person who came up with the idea to cover the reactor with lead and sand, which wasn't, like, a great idea, but it was an idea.
Right.
And he wasn't honored.
Better than most that, like, people were not coming up with. Like,
Right.
Sure.
Like, let it burn itself out, you know?
Right.
But he wasn't honored as a hero for any of it. A lot of people were honored for what they did to help with the cleanup, and he was given a watch and a whole sievert of radiation exposure that seeded a cancer in his blood. So he wasn't doing well. He felt a lot of guilt for what happened, and he attempted to kill himself in May of 1987 before his cancer could kill him. But he ended up getting his stomach pumped and survived. And then a day after the second anniversary of the disaster, on April 27th, 1988, he hanged himself to death in his apartment.
Damn.
In July of 1987, the policymakers of the Communist Party held their trial against the managers of the power plant. They held these people solely responsible for the accident. It didn't matter to the government that these men suffered tremendously themselves, both health-wise and mental health-wise. Dyatlov did not leave the hospital in Moscow until November of 1986, and there the doctors estimated he absorbed roughly 5.5 sieverts of radiation from the gamma burns on his legs. Viktor Brukhanov absorbed 2.5 sieverts and suffered from acute radiation syndrome in the form of regular headaches and excruciating pain behind his ears. He spent a year in a KGB prison awaiting trial, during which time his wife had no access to his bank account, and she was forced to return to work at the plant when the first of the other 3 reactors got back online in the fall of 1986.
Wow.
Nikolai Fomin also went straight from the hospital to prison, where he continued to suffer from ARS and a deep depression that led him to attempt suicide in his cell in March of 1987. Doctors saved his life and then sent him right back to his cell to continue to await trial.
Wow.
Now, according to Soviet law, for whatever reason, the trial needed to be held in the same location where the alleged crime occurred. And so the managers were tried in the city of Chernobyl while radiation levels were still through the roof, and where the streets had recently all been repaved with non-contaminated asphalt, and dosimeters were now permanently installed in the city center, because that's Chernobyl.
Great idea, though. Great idea.
The tight security of the city, because of these safety precautions, played into authorities' favor because now they had complete control over the building where the trial occurred. The trial lasted 18 days from July 7th to the 29th, and journalists were only permitted inside the makeshift courthouse on 2 of them, during the opening and then the closing arguments. The managers were charged with violating safety rules, abuse of power that led them to withhold information about the scope of the accident, and negligence.
I don't think that second one was them, though.
No. I mean,
Like, that was not them.
if you were to take 6 guys that you need to hold responsible, it's not middle management, right?
Right.
Maybe there's 6 guys at the top who could be held responsible, but it's not these guys. Fomin threw blame onto his colleagues at the trial and was like, it was definitely their fault. It wasn't my fault. It was middle management, and it was these other 5 guys. But the others refused to do the same or to blame their deceased subordinates. Brukhanov instead admitted that he was negligent in his management, and Dyatlov insisted that no violations would have occurred if the reactor had been in proper working condition on the day of the accident, which, 100%. That's 100% true.
Right. Like, that's spot on.
Unfortunately, their fates were probably determined in Moscow ahead of the trial. The 3 men I mentioned were sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in a penal colony, while the other 3 managers only received 3 to 5 years in prison. Brukhanov was released from his prison sentence early for good behavior in 1991. Fomin's mental health continued to decline during his imprisonment, and he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital after only 2 years in 1990. And then after discharge, he found work at a power plant in Moscow. Dyatlov was also released in 1990 due to declining physical health and vocally spoke out against the faults of the reactor until his death from bone marrow cancer in 1995.
Ugh.
But back in 1998, with the guilty charged, the government desperately wanted to put the accident in the past and return to the way things had been before. The third remaining unit at Chernobyl was brought back online on December 4th, 1987, and orders had been given to resume work on Units 5 and 6, which had been thought dead since the night of the explosion, but hey, we gotta
We're
move
back
on.
online, boys.
Yeah. The roof of Unit 3 was still covered in radioactive debris, and the inside has such high levels of radioactivity that workers had to rotate to the unit in shifts from other units to avoid overexposure. Changes had been made to all of the RBMK reactors in the entire USSR following the explosion, including the 3 units remaining at Chernobyl. And this was mostly following Legasov's speech in 1986, because Kat was out of the bag then.
Mm-hmm.
They all now used fuel with more highly enriched uranium. They received extra control rods, and the emergency shutdown systems were updated to be faster and more effective. Still, analysis showed that bad construction and poor staff discipline caused hundreds of minor accidents a year.
Hundreds of accidents is not good when we just had a Chernobyl.
Yeah. Like, it's literally in the lexicon of what an accident is. Yeah. The city of Pripyat remained empty. Now the workers inhabited a new Atomgrad called Slavutych, 28 miles northeast of the ruins of the first company city that now lay abandoned. But just as modern, and with its own statue of Lenin in the central market square. Like, do you think that maybe that was like a cursed item that they just kept moving?
Right. They're like, no, let's do it again.
Yeah, same way as last time.
Yeah, again.
Yeah, no lessons were being learned by the people who most mattered for the lessons to be learned. And Slavutych, this time, which was different from Pripyat, was built on forest land contaminated with cesium, ruthenium, cerium, strontium, and plutonium radioisotopes. So that's a fun change. Since the radiation exposure was within the limits permitted for populations living near power plants, workers still moved there. We're not told about the radiation, but the walking paths were asphalted, just in case. Streets were regularly washed. And the fallen leaves and trees of the forest were collected before anyone might collect a contaminated mushroom from the underbrush.
Okay.
Of course,
Sure.
They know is basically what we know now, right? Like, almost as much as we know now, they are beginning to know. Word is leaking out, people have been talking, and no one wants to live in Slavutych. No one wants to work at the Chernobyl power plant. No one wants to keep up the facade of normalcy for a country that put them in danger without telling them. No one wants to work somewhere that was directly responsible for the injuries and deaths of their colleagues, friends, and family, and then blamed those people for their own injuries and deaths.
Right. Right. Like,
morale is not good.
No. And rightfully so. Like, I mean, why?
Yeah. Like, why are we doing this again? Is it so important that we look good instead of looking like we're learning from this? Soviet scientists admitted for the first time in 1988 that 17.5 million people, including 2.5 million children, lived in seriously contaminated areas of the USSR at the time of the explosion. Of these nearly 18 million people, a mere 696,000 were examined by medical authorities by the end of 1986. And they maintained that between April 1986 and May of 1988, only 31 people tops died as a result of the disaster. None of whom, they said, were in the general population. They were all workers at the plant. And the health minister was even so bold as to declare, we can today be certain that there are no effects of the Chernobyl accident on human health.
I don't know about that one, boss.
And since word got out and since things changed, there's a little bit of a kinship between the survivors of the Chernobyl accident, and the fallout, and the survivors of the bombings of Japan. Like, they kind of understand each other a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it feels exceptionally bold to have had the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki happen 40 years beforehand, and to still be like, 2 years out, we're good. We're golden. No
Right.
pack.
Like,
Yeah.
they know better. They know
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Couples in Kyiv were afraid to have children, and any illness that popped up came with a creeping anxiety that this is the manifestations of radiation exposure. This is it. It's inside of me. It's happening. And these worries were dismissed by overly confident lead scientists as a new psychological condition called radiophobia.
Oh my God. Like, who is not phobic
Of
of
radiation.
radiation? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, what?
But no, you shouldn't be
What?
scared of it. It's just,
Oh my God.
yeah.
Okay. Sure.
But people knew better. Like, you and I can give them credit. They knew better. Obviously, they knew better.
Yeah.
And the drive to learn information that was knowingly now, absolutely without a doubt, we know it was withheld from us. This led them to discover all sorts of other things that were being hidden from them. Like, now the floodgates on information are opened. The Soviet public was just now, for the first time, hearing stories of drug addiction, of abortion, of, actual tales from the war in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union was involved in, and the inner workings of the Chernobyl power plant. There were documentaries and exposés, and all of this revealed that more land was contaminated than was ever admitted to. And now the Belarusian government was estimating that another 100,000 people needed to be evacuated. In 1989, farmers reported increased numbers of birth defects on their land 25 miles west of the exclusion zone. Piglets were born with frog-like eyes, and calves were born without heads. In October... I know, it's so sad. In October of that year, a news outlet reported that hundreds of metric tons of radioactively contaminated pork and beef had been made into sausages and sold to customers since 1986. Workers at the meat factory were even paid extra as compensation for their exposure to radiation. But party leaders insisted that the meat was safe to consume.
No.
Contamination of meat, dairy, and produce with strontium and cesium was incredibly widespread, affecting farms in Minsk, Finland, and France. In Britain, there were restrictions on the sale of sheep from North Wales because of contaminated grazing areas until 2012.
Oh my God.
The meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, and this is maybe the only silver lining that's in this story.
Okay.
By the time the Berlin Wall fell at the start of November 1989, the days of the Soviet Union were numbered. Aside from the civil unrest across the Union caused by the disaster and the lack of trust people had in their government, the party was hemorrhaging money. And then, mutated animals and plants were discovered in Pripyat in Belarus, and the latter intended to open a wildlife preserve for conservation and research purposes. Already, though, the disaster had cost the government $128 billion, which is roughly the entire Soviet defense budget for 1989 and the equivalent of $326 billion today.
That's a pretty penny.
6,000 people in Lithuania protested the Ignalina nuclear power plant, where 2 new RBMK 1500 reactors were installed. This triggered more protests across 3 Baltic countries that eventually led them to withdraw from the Soviet Union. 80,000 people marched in Belarus, demanding to be relocated from their contaminated land. After opposition to a new plant in Crimea led to strikes, the Supreme Court of Ukraine drew up an agreement to close all 3 of the remaining reactors at Chernobyl by the end of 1995, and a moratorium was placed on the building of new plants in Ukraine. The closing of the reactors became all the more urgent when the roof of Unit 2 caught fire in 1991.
No. No.
Like, it's just going to keep causing problems until it's gone.
Yeah.
For economic reasons that really frustrated the G7 nations in particular, Ukraine kept running the plant until 1997. restarted operations in 1998, and didn't officially shut down until December 15th of 2000, which was 24 years ago to the day of this recording. Despite the fact that much more work was needed to clean up the exclusion zone, no one wanted to do it, and military reservists now refuse to report there when given orders, and so liquidation halted in December of 1990. The liquidators were honored as heroes and gifted with special medals, but when they began to inevitably fall ill, doctors hesitated to connect their maladies to the work they'd so heroically undertaken. In December of 1991, Ukraine voted to declare independence from the USSR, and on my birthday, December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 6 years after the ill-fated May Day parade in Kyiv, the rates of thyroid cancer in child attendees dramatically increased. It's not a common disease, especially in children under 15, and so it's easier to attribute these cases to the exposure from the accident and from drinking contaminated milk. Children 0 to 4 years old were the most susceptible, and most cases manifested between 4 and 5 years after the accident. But 5,000 cases of thyroid cancer were diagnosed by 2005, and 15 children had died. Numbers assessed by the UN between 1991 and 2015 put the number of thyroid cancer cases just for people who were children during the accident at around 20,000.
Oof.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a big difference.
Yeah. In 2006, Mikhail Gorbachev admitted that deciding to hold the parades despite the danger just to avoid the spread of misinformation and panic was a mistake. It was a mistake. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't take responsibility for the decision or for the many negative health outcomes that came as a result of exposure. And we'll never know the true death toll from the accident, because the sequencing from behind the Iron Curtain, it could be 28 or 31 or 50 or thousands, but we can never truly know because documents were changed and maybe people died without ever reporting their illness. We'll just never know. Mechanical engineer Alexander Yuchenko survived beta burns from radiation exposure on the night of the explosion, but illness didn't strike for him until January of 2007.
Oh, wow.
So there's like a period where we could still be waiting for some people to show signs. He came down with a fever and got blood draws that showed nothing out of the ordinary. But when he finally entered the hospital, doctors discovered his spleen was enlarged, which was a sign of leukemia, and his bone marrow was beginning to fail. He died less than 2 years later. And that's what I think is crazy, is that 21 years later, he gets these symptoms, and he had an acute exposure.
Right. And
then he dies within 2 years. And it's difficult to track the long-term consequences of the low-level radiation, which is the main difference between the outcomes from Hiroshima versus Chernobyl. The general population, including children and pregnant individuals, were exposed to high levels of radiation when the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. But in the USSR, the general population was exposed to the lower radiation fallout. Children are still more susceptible in both cases, but as they age, they are exposed to many other things which can cause cancer. Even for people exposed to high doses acutely who have delayed illness presentation, they could have ended up with certain illnesses as a result of diet, genetics, and other environmental factors that can't easily be teased apart.
That's fair.
In fact, the WHO concluded in 2006 that the worst health outcome for the people who lived in the region of interest was mental health. Basically, feeling doomed by radiation exposure led to more depression and anxiety, but also higher rates of smoking and alcoholism, and all of this makes health assessments that much more complicated. And sadly, part of the anxiety experienced was among pregnant individuals who feared for the life and livelihood of their unborn children. Greece was impacted by the fallout from the explosion, and is a country where abortions have historically been easily and legally obtained. It is estimated that in Greece alone, roughly 2,500 pregnancies were terminated early in 1986 because of fears of health impacts from Chernobyl. But abortions can't be tracked in the same way in Soviet Ukraine and Belarus, so we can't truly know. But in the HBO documentary, a woman named Marina Sivets described how authorities wanted to force her to have an abortion for fear of damage to the baby. but she had to escape them, like literally run away and then hide from police until her baby was born. And luckily, her baby was born healthy, but, you know, there were some people who were exposed to higher levels of radiation, like at the May Day parade, who did lose their child. In the years that followed the accident, though, researchers have found little evidence to show that low-level exposure while in utero produced statistically significant rates of stillbirth or birth defects. So all of these terminated pregnancies may have been terminated needlessly.
That's really sad.
It is sad.
But I mean, like, I don't blame them. Like, I don't blame them for thinking that way.
No, no. Yeah, I mean, you got to do what you think is best for you and your baby. It's unfortunate that the guidance, well, not even guidance, because guidance is like the third step of it, right? It's unfortunate that their government didn't protect them, so it was never an issue to begin with.
Right.
Yeah. It's hard to tell who will and won't get cancer. We talked about it a little last time, but basically the main difference that can be identified on a biological level, even if it can't be totally replicated, is that there are deterministic effects and stochastic effects from radiation that cause cancer. I mean, the guys who went under the reactor, they're fine.
Right.
Dyatlov, he died from, leukemia. And it's really hard to tell who's going to be impacted by what. Deterministic effects result from radiation-induced cell death. And that still depends on absorbed dose, rate, radiation types, all the stuff I've mentioned already. But the severity of these deterministic effects increases linearly with absorbed dose. The dose makes the poison. That's why we're talking about it on a toxicology podcast. Clinical presentations that indicate someone is experiencing this cell death include what we've already mentioned with the liquidators: bloody diarrhea, bone marrow failure, skin disturbance. But there are some delayed symptoms, like, leukemia, cataracts, cardiovascular disorders, and necrosis. The stochastic effects are the ones that are harder to document and trace. We know that low-level exposure to ionizing radiation is capable of damaging our DNA, and this can lead to cancer or to damaging the DNA of our future children. But the probability of the occurrence of stochastic effects, but not the severity of the effects, depends on the dose. So we're looking at probability rather than the severity of the outcome. And any exposure to ionizing radiation with no threshold dose, just any amount of ionizing radiation, can initiate the clock for stochastic effects.
Oh, interesting.
And there are a number of people who have lived through the accident that seem to be totally unaffected. These stochastic effects either aren't going to or haven't kicked in for them. Because not everyone who was ordered to evacuate the exclusion zone did. They were like, this is my home, why would I leave it? Interestingly, these people who were admittedly older seemed just fine. And also, the decommissioning team and the scientists live in the exclusion zone. They actually live in Chernobyl, which isn't... It's not as close to the power plant as you'd think. So, I don't know. It's interesting what it looks like, nearly...
long term.
People have started exploring the exclusion zone as a form of dark tourism. In 2018, an estimated 60,000 people visited Pripyat.
I saw a video about that, and it was expensive.
Oh, yeah?
You're paying, it was a dark tourism, documentary thing, and it's you're paying big money to go do this.
Right.
Not to judge. People have different tastes, but damn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and they're able to do that because the radiation in the exclusion zone isn't consistent, and so it's not, consistently high. it's... There are maps of it, but I suppose if you're there and you have your little Geiger counter, you're like, oh, it's getting high, we can't stay here long, and there's a rush of adrenaline or something, but...
Sure.
But just like there are hot spots outside of the zone, there are hot spots within it. And within the zone, radioactivity ranges from 0, there's no, noticeable radioactivity, to 12.07 microsieverts per hour. And so that means if I were to fly to Kyiv to visit the exclusion zone, waste all of my money and go do some urban exploring in a group, if a war wasn't happening, you can't do it right now because of the war, I would potentially be exposed to higher levels of radiation on the flight than in some regions of the 30-kilometer exclusion zone.
Oh, interesting.
And so based on this, authorities are considering redrawing the lines of the zone and then lifting restrictions in the areas that are deemed fit for habitation so that people can move back in, we can use the land. I mean, I don't think that they're trying to really get things back to normal at this point because it's
Right.
Ukraine and not the USSR, but they're just like, if we can redraw the lines, maybe we should. But these low levels, these inconsistent readings, this is perhaps why both humans and non-human animals have been able to survive and even thrive in this, basically abandoned region.
Right.
Wolves live in the region now, and they actually have like pretty natural lives for wolves because they feed on wild prey other than like livestock and crops and pets. So they are living pretty good wolf lives there.
Right.
A group of endangered wild horses was released into the region in 1998 to graze overgrowth and prevent wildfires, and they've managed to double their numbers in that time.
Huh. Okay.
And as Jeff Goldblum said in Jurassic Park, life finds a way. There are 3 species of extremophile bacteria that have been discovered in the decommissioned plant. And these bacteria are interesting because they need high levels of radiation to survive. They use melanin to capture and eat the radiation, similarly to how the melanin on our skin captures UV radiation from the sun. But they're actually, not just like this novel thing we've found in the unit. Because of their unique ability to interact with radiation without damage that causes cell death, microbiologists are interested in studying them to create new vaccines that could protect our DNA while inducing damage in targeted microbes. And I'd heard about these extremophiles before just because they're kind of interesting, but I thought
it is interesting.
Yeah, I thought they just existed as like this kind of novel thing, even if they were for vaccines. Like, they must not be in very, high numbers, maybe as single cells or, really small clusters. But a listener actually sent me a link about one of these strains of bacteria in particular that exists as a pretty thick black mold that covers the inside of the Unit 4 reactor. And because it's eating the radiation, it's actually helping to battle the radiation levels in the unit.
Huh.
Yeah. So scientists are looking to use this bacterium in other radioactively contaminated areas on the planet and have, their sights on uses in space to protect astronauts from radiation.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. So thank you to Susan for sending me that update on the extremophiles. But what is the plan for Chernobyl ultimately? The sarcophagus that they built was meant to last for 100 years, but was replaced in 2016 with a steel cover and a less interesting name of the new safe confinement. This confinement cost $1.5 billion, paid for by 43 different countries. It took 6 years to complete, is 3 times as large as St. Peter's Basilica, and is tall enough to cover the Statue of Liberty.
Damn.
So that is now what is covering. I think the sarcophagus is still in there, but that is now what's covering the whole unit.
Okay.
But the complete decommissioning of Chernobyl is going to take many, many years. We're probably not going to see an environmentally safe area around Unit 4 for at least another 100 years, if that. But even then, once we can say Chernobyl, where the former power plant was, is safe, we'll still have buried the fuel-contaminating materials somewhere else or have it stored in metal containers, and we'll just be waiting for that radioactivity to decay to a safe level for, however many years, however many hundreds of years, potentially.
Right.
While it's sitting there, though, I don't think that there is much of a concern that anything's really going to happen. There's a little bit of a concern, but there's not much of a concern. And the reason that I don't think there's that much of a concern is based on the discovery of the fuel-containing material that we call the elephant's foot. Have you heard of the elephant's foot?
Mm-mm.
Okay, it's pretty neat, as far as Chernobyl neat. It's it's a 2-ton column of cooled lava from superheated silicon dioxide, titanium, zirconium, and uranium that's only 3 feet tall, but it emits enough radiation to kill anyone who stands near it for 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
It is intensely radioactive. And researchers discovered it in the heart of reactor 4 when they started to search for the fuel to make sure that, the China syndrome wasn't going to happen and that we weren't going to bore through the containment vessel we put underneath into the water table. And so they find this, they take a sample of the foot, and they realize it doesn't have any lead. And they're like, we dropped so much lead. Like, shouldn't some of the lead have ended up
Right.
in
You'd
this
think.
thing?
You
Yeah.
would think.
Yeah, but apparently not. And so, despite Legasov's best intentions and despite everything that the helicopter pilots did, the sand that we dropped didn't smother the fire at all. It burnt itself out.
Wow.
So the elephant's foot is just one radioactive stalagmite out of many from the oozing lava that flowed through 3 floors of the unit and then cooled upon contacting... Could you hear that?
I did.
Can I help you? I'm almost done. Can I help you? I don't know where it was. And cooled upon contact with the water in the unit in the minutes and days after the accident. Others that have been mapped in the interior of the sarcophagus include the drop, the icicle, the stalagmite, and the heap. And researchers also discovered a new substance, a blue crystal made out of uranium and zirconium called Chernobylite,
Oh, wow.
which is full of bad vibes, and you won't be finding at your local rock shop.
Yeah.
In 1990, some parts of the radioactive monstrosity we call the elephant foot were still over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty hot for only being 4 years
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
But it's not anywhere near the temperatures that researchers worried about in regards to China syndrome. So it appears to be cooling down. We don't have to worry about it boring through the ground. There is a writer, I think, at Scientific American, or he was, and he may or may not be associated with the DoD, but I can't figure out his credentials. And he insists that the elephant's foot is going to eat through the container and kill us all. But I haven't seen anybody else suggest that, so I think we're fine. While the remaining intact units are being decommissioned, we still have to keep them dormant, which means continuing to run power to them and continuing to supply them with coolant water. So there is still the ongoing risk of the units losing power, as they did in March of 2022, when Russian forces occupying Chernobyl disconnected the power plant from the grid accidentally. But, as long as that doesn't happen again, maybe we're fine. I guess there is
We're fine.
still a little bit of a risk, and there just always will be
Yeah.
until in 100 years it's totally gone. But outside of the former USSR, Chernobyl easily faded into the past. The world moved on, and concerns about peak fossil fuel usage and global warming made nuclear power look like an okay idea again. The United States drew up plans to build our first plant in 30 years, and in 2011, Ukraine announced plans for 2 new reactors near Chernobyl. But just days after this announcement, the world learned of an accident at the Tokyo Electric Power Plant in Fukushima, Japan. And so, once again, the world shuddered at the idea of widespread nuclear power. Japan shut down all 48 of their remaining reactors. Germany shut down 17 of theirs with the intention to shut down the rest by 2022. And existing plans for new reactors in the U.S. were canceled. But that still leaves us with 100 in operation. 3 Mile Island, the near miss that predated Chernobyl, was brought back online until 2019, but Microsoft has plans to recommission it, to add an additional 835 megawatts of energy to power their AI. Microsoft won't be keeping the loaded name of 3 Mile Island, and so instead, keep an eye out for news about the Crane Clean Energy Center.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I was real bummed out when I heard that they were bringing a decommissioned nuclear power plant back online for AI. Like, this is
that's
truly
kind of
the
a
dark
bummer.
future. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a bummer, man.
Fossil fuel is running out, and the population is growing, and our need for energy is growing. Argonne National Labs has demonstrated a new kind of nuclear reactor that's supposed to be safer because it never reaches criticality. Investors like Bill Gates are interested in these kinds of discoveries because they can provide us with huge energy yields. But I'm not sure if people will be more excited than hydroelectric plants or wind-powered plants. If you're not excited, you can protest. Protests helped to stop construction of reactors in Ukraine and Belarus and pushed their policy towards pro-environmental efforts. The progress was slow, but so is all social change. And we can expect that there is going to be some flip-flopping if times are bad versus when times are good. And is it worth the investment of our tax dollars to have high yields of energy when it seems like a low-risk, high-consequence type of situation if something were to happen?
Mm-hmm.
So that is it. That is all of Chernobyl, and I am glad to be walking away from this story now.
Yeah, that's a big one. It was a big dark one.
Big dark one. Yeah. So this is the last episode of the season. It wasn't supposed to be. Obviously, things went a little differently than they typically do at the end of the seasons, but thank you for being patient with us as we release this. We will return on the main channel in February, and until then, we will still be releasing episodes over on Patreon. So we'll have a microdose releasing later this month, I promise, and then we'll have one in January ahead of the new season starting.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, so before we go on our break, I just want to give a call out to our current patrons. And if you'd like to join us on Patreon, it's a ton of fun over there. You'll get content over the winter break, and you can join us for free even. Check it out and see if you like it. But our current paying patrons are K-Post, Susan, Catherine, Jay, Lula, Izzy, and Patrick. So thank you all for your support. And thank all of you, even if you're not patrons or paying patrons. Thank you for listening and supporting us. Yeah, we've gotten a lot of new listeners this year, and I'm excited for next season. It's going to be dark, and I say that coming off of Chernobyl, so
alrighty then.
Prepare yourselves for that one.
Buckling up. I'll buckle up.
Yeah. And we will see you in February. Bye for now.
Bye. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus. Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.